doctor mistakes 12-year-old's pain for pregnancy, then uncovers the terrifying truth. The Peterson family lived in the quiet, tree-lined suburb of Maplewood, New Jersey. Their life was, on the surface, the epitome of American normalcy: a two-story colonial home with a well-tended lawn, 2 cars in the driveway, and a golden retriever named Buddy who greeted everyone with enthusiastic tail wags. David Peterson, 45, was an accountant, a practical and methodical man who valued stability and routine. He worked long hours at a local firm, providing a comfortable life for his family. He was a loving father, but he tended to be reserved, more comfortable with spreadsheets and numbers than with expressing his emotions. His wife, Sarah, 42, was a stay-at-home mom, a warm and nurturing woman who dedicated her life to her family. She was the heart of the home, the glue that held everything together. She was active in the PTA, volunteered at the local library, and always had a batch of freshly baked cookies ready for her children. They had 2 children, 16-year-old Ethan, a typical teenager obsessed with video games and his social life, and 12-year-old Mia, a sweet, sensitive girl with a passion for reading and a quiet, introspective nature. Mia was a 6th grader at Maplewood Middle School. She was a good student, earning mostly A's and B's. She wasn't particularly athletic or outgoing, but she had a small group of close friends with whom she shared secrets, dreams, and a love of fantasy novels. She was a gentle soul, kind to animals, and always willing to help others. She was going through the awkward transition from childhood to adolescence, a time of physical and emotional changes that she didn't quite understand. She was starting to notice boys, starting to feel self-conscious about her appearance, starting to experience the confusing mix of emotions that came with puberty. The Petersons were a close-knit family, though not without their usual challenges. David and Sarah sometimes argued about finances or parenting styles, and Ethan's teenage rebellion often tested their patience. But beneath the surface tensions, there was a deep well of love and mutual respect. They ate dinner together most nights, went on family vacations, and supported each other through thick and thin. They believed they were a typical, happy family. They believed they knew their children, that they were aware of everything that was happening in their lives. They were, in many ways, living the American dream. But they were about to discover that even the most seemingly perfect lives could be shattered by unexpected events, by medical mysteries that could test the limits of their faith, their love, and their understanding. Their seemingly perfect world was about to be turned upside down. The onset of Mia's pain was sudden and severe. It was a Saturday afternoon in early May, a beautiful spring day with clear blue skies and a gentle breeze. The Petersons were enjoying a rare moment of family time, playing a board game in the living room. Mia, who had been unusually quiet all day, suddenly doubled over, clutching her abdomen. Her face contorted in agony, and she let out a sharp cry. "Mia, what's wrong?" Sarah exclaimed, rushing to her daughter's side. Mia couldn't speak. She just shook her head, her body racked with pain. Tears streamed down her face, and her breath came in short, ragged gasps. David, alarmed by his daughter's distress, knelt beside her, trying to assess the situation. "Where does it hurt, honey?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Mia pointed to her lower abdomen, her fingers digging into her flesh. The pain was so intense that she couldn't even straighten up. Ethan, who had initially been dismissive of his sister's discomfort, now looked worried. "She looks really bad, Dad," he said. Sarah, her anxiety rising, tried to comfort Mia. "It's okay, sweetie," she said, stroking her daughter's hair. "Just breathe. We'll figure this out." But the pain didn't subside. It continued to intensify, waves of agony washing over Mia, making her writhe and moan. Her face was pale and clammy, and her body was trembling. David, realizing that this was more than just a stomachache, made a quick decision. "We need to get her to the hospital," he said, his voice firm and decisive. He scooped Mia up in his arms, her small body feeling surprisingly light. Sarah grabbed her purse and keys, and they rushed out of the house, their hearts pounding with fear and uncertainty. The drive to the hospital was a blur. David sped through the quiet streets of Maplewood, his mind racing with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Sarah sat in the back seat with Mia, holding her hand, trying to soothe her, but her own anxiety was palpable. Mia continued to cry out in pain, her body convulsing with each spasm. She kept repeating, "It hurts, Mommy. It hurts so bad." Sarah felt helpless, desperate. She had never seen her daughter in so much pain, and she didn't know what to do. She prayed that it was nothing serious, that it was just a bad cramp, a stomach bug, anything but something truly terrible. They arrived at the emergency room of Maplewood General Hospital, the tires screeching as David pulled up to the entrance. He carried Mia inside, shouting for help, his voice filled with a desperation he had never known before. The peaceful Saturday afternoon had turned into a nightmare, and they had no idea what was causing it. Their lives were about to change. The emergency room at Maplewood General was a scene of controlled chaos. Nurses rushed about, doctors barked orders, and patients waited anxiously, their faces etched with pain, worry, and fear. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the sounds of beeping monitors, muffled cries, and hurried footsteps. David carried Mia through the double doors, shouting for a doctor, his voice hoarse with panic. A nurse quickly assessed the situation, her eyes widening as she saw Mia's condition. She directed them to a trauma bay, where a team of medical professionals immediately surrounded Mia, their movements swift and efficient. Sarah stood beside David, her hand gripping his arm so tightly that her knuckles were white. She felt a wave of nausea, a sense of unreality. This couldn't be happening. Not to her daughter. Not to her sweet, gentle Mia. The doctors and nurses began their work, cutting away Mia's clothes, inserting for lines, attaching monitors, and firing questions at David and Sarah. How long has she been in pain? Any previous medical conditions? Any allergies? When was her last menstrual period? David and Sarah answered as best they could, their voices trembling, their minds struggling to process the rapid-fire questions and the overwhelming sense of urgency. The last question, about Mia's last menstrual period, caught them off guard. They looked at each other, confused. Mia was only 12 years old. She had just started puberty. Her periods were irregular, unpredictable. "I don't know," Sarah stammered. "I don't think she's had one in a while. But she's only 12. The doctor, a young resident named Dr. Emily Carter, nodded, her expression serious. She continued her examination, palpating Mia's abdomen, her touch gentle but firm. Mia winced in pain, her body tensing. Dr. Carter felt a distinct mass in Mia's lower abdomen, a firmness that shouldn't be there. She exchanged a look with the attending physician, Dr. Robert Chen, a seasoned emergency room doctor with years of experience. "We need to get an ultrasound, stat," Dr. Chen said, his voice calm but urgent. "And a pregnancy test." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Pregnancy. At 12 years old. It seemed impossible, unthinkable. David and Sarah stared at the doctors, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror. The possibility, however remote, planted a seed of dread in their hearts, a seed that would soon blossom into a full-blown nightmare. The tension in the room was now almost unbearable. The situation had just become much more serious. The ultrasound technician arrived, wheeling in a portable machine. The gel felt cold on Mia's skin, and the pressure of the probe against her abdomen made her whimper. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the whirring of the ultrasound machine. Dr. Carter and Dr. Chen watched the screen intently, their faces etched with concentration. The images were grainy and indistinct, but they revealed something that made their hearts sink. "There's a mass," Dr. Carter said, her voice low. "A large one. In her lower abdomen." Dr. Chen nodded, his expression grim. "It could be a number of things," he said. "But given her age and the location." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. They suspected a pregnancy, a possibility that was both terrifying and deeply disturbing. The pregnancy test came back positive. Dr. Chen turned to David and Sarah, his face somber. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But your daughter is pregnant." The words hit David and Sarah like a physical blow. They stared at the doctor, their minds reeling, unable to process the information. "Pregnant," David repeated, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "But she's only 12. That's impossible." "I know this is a shock," Dr. Chen said. "But the test is positive, and the ultrasound shows a mass consistent with a pregnancy." Sarah began to sob, her body shaking with the force of her grief and fear. "No," she cried. No, it can't be true. My baby, my baby. David, his face pale and drawn, put his arm around Sarah, trying to comfort her, but he was struggling to contain his own emotions. He felt a surge of anger, a protective rage directed at whoever had done this to his daughter. Who? He demanded, his voice trembling. Who did this to her? Dr. Chen explained that they would need to conduct further tests to determine the gestational age of the fetus and to rule out other possibilities. He also explained that they were legally obligated to report the suspected abuse to Child Protective Services and the police. David and Sarah, overwhelmed by the news, began to argue. This can't be happening, Sarah said. She's just a baby. How could we not know? Someone has to be responsible for this, growled David. I'm going to find out who did this. Don't start, David. This isn't the time, replied Sarah. It is exactly the time. Our little girl. David couldn't finish. The room was filled with tension, grief, and disbelief. The initial shock was giving way to a torrent of emotions, and the parents were struggling to cope. They couldn't comprehend what they had just been told, and the implications were devastating. Their daughter, their little girl, was pregnant. It was a parent's worst nightmare come true. They needed answers, but they also needed to support each other. The hours that followed the initial diagnosis were a blur of confusion, anger, and denial for David and Sarah. They were ushered into a small, private waiting room, a sterile space that offered little comfort. They sat there, numb with shock, trying to process the unimaginable news. David paced the room, his mind racing, his fists clenched. He couldn't shake the image of his daughter, his sweet, innocent Mia, being violated, abused. He felt a primal rage, a desperate need to find the perpetrator and make him pay. I'm going to kill him, he muttered, his voice low and menacing. Whoever did this to her, I'm going to kill him. Sarah, huddled in a chair, her face buried in her hands, was sobbing uncontrollably. She couldn't believe this was happening. She felt like she had failed as a mother, that she had somehow allowed this terrible thing to happen to her daughter. How could we not know? She cried. How could we have been so blind? We should have protected her. She remembered the times Mia had been withdrawn, the times she had complained of stomachaches, the times she had seemed afraid. She had dismissed those signs as typical preteen behavior, as growing pains, as nothing to worry about. She had been so busy with work, with Ethan, with the daily stresses of life, that she had failed to see the danger lurking in the shadows. She had failed to protect her daughter from a predator. David, despite his anger, tried to comfort Sarah. He sat beside her, putting his arm around her, his own tears mingling with hers. It's not your fault, he said, his voice hoarse. We didn't know. We couldn't have known. But deep down, he blamed himself as well. He had been too distant, too preoccupied with work, too focused on providing for his family financially that he had neglected their emotional needs. He had failed to be the father Mia needed, the protector she deserved. They argued, their grief and fear manifesting as anger and blame. They lashed out at each other, saying things they didn't mean, their words fueled by the unbearable pain of the situation. You were always working, Sarah accused. You never paid attention to her. And you were always so busy with your volunteering and your friends, David retorted. You were never home. Their argument escalated, their voices rising, until a nurse intervened, reminding them that they needed to be strong for Mia, that they needed to present a united front. They fell silent, ashamed of their outburst, realizing that their anger was misdirected. They were both victims of this terrible crime, and they needed to support each other, not tear each other apart. They sat there, in the sterile waiting room, their hearts heavy with grief, their minds filled with questions, their future uncertain. They were united in their love for Mia, and in their determination to see justice done. But they were also deeply wounded, their family shattered, their lives forever changed. They needed to find a way to navigate this nightmare, to support their daughter, and to somehow find a way to heal. They knew it would not be easy. After what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Chen returned to the waiting room, his expression grave. He had the results of the additional tests. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, he began, his voice calm and professional. We've completed the ultrasound and the other tests, and we've discovered something unexpected. David and Sarah held their breath, bracing themselves for more bad news. Mia is not pregnant, Dr. Chen said. The words hung in the air, a moment of stunned silence. Then, a wave of relief washed over David and Sarah, so intense that it almost brought them to their knees. Not pregnant, David repeated, his voice trembling. But the test, the ultrasound. The pregnancy test was a false positive, Dr. Chen explained. It can happen, rarely, but it can happen. And the mass we saw on the ultrasound, it's not a fetus. It's a cyst. A very large ovarian cyst. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A cyst, she said. But how? Dr. Chen explained that ovarian cysts were relatively common, even in young girls. Most were small and harmless, causing no symptoms and resolving on their own. But occasionally, a cyst could grow to a significant size, causing pain, pressure, and other complications. In Mia's case, he said, the cyst is very large. It's pressing on her other organs, causing the severe abdominal pain. And it's also producing hormones, which is what likely triggered the false positive on the pregnancy test. He paused, then added, it's also life-threatening. If it ruptures or twists, it could cause internal bleeding and other serious complications. We need to operate immediately. The relief that David and Sarah had felt moments earlier was replaced by a new wave of fear. Surgery. Their 12-year-old daughter needed emergency surgery. They were overwhelmed, terrified, but they also felt a surge of gratitude. Mia was not pregnant. She had not been violated. She was sick, yes, but her illness was treatable. It was a medical condition, not a crime. The shift in emotions was dramatic. The accusations, the anger, the blame, all of that dissolved in the face of this new, terrifying reality. They were no longer dealing with the aftermath of a sexual assault, but with a serious medical emergency. And they needed to focus all their energy on supporting Mia and getting her the best possible care. Dr. Chen explained the surgical procedure, the risks, and the expected recovery time. He answered their questions patiently and thoroughly, reassuring them that Mia was in good hands. We have an excellent surgical team here, he said, and we'll do everything we can to ensure that Mia has a successful outcome. David and Sarah, clinging to each other, nodded their understanding. They signed the consent forms, their hands shaking, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and hope. They were terrified of the surgery, but they also knew that it was Mia's only chance. They were allowed to see Mia briefly before she was taken to the operating room. She was lying in a hospital bed, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with fear. "Mommy, Daddy," she whispered. "What's happening?" Sarah knelt beside the bed, taking Mia's hand. "You're going to be okay, sweetie," she said, her voice trembling. "You have a cyst. It's like a big bubble, and the doctors need to take it out." Am I going to die?" Mia asked, her voice barely audible. "No, honey," David said, his voice choked with emotion. "You're not going to die. You're going to be fine. The doctors are going to take good care of you." They hugged her, kissed her, and told her they loved her. They tried to be strong to reassure her, but their own fear was palpable. As Mia was wheeled away, Sarah and David held each other tightly, their tears flowing freely. They were united in their love for their daughter, in their fear for her well-being, and in their desperate prayer for a successful outcome. The nightmare had shifted, but it was far from over. They prepared themselves for a long and anxious wait. Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room several hours later, his surgical mask pulled down, his expression weary but reassuring. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," he said, "the surgery went well. We were able to remove the cyst completely. Mia is in recovery, and she's doing fine." David and Sarah sagged with relief, their bodies weak with the release of tension. They embraced each other, tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. "Thank God," Sarah whispered. "Thank God she's okay." "Can we see her?" David asked. "Yes, of course," Dr. Chen said. "She's still a little groggy from the anesthesia, but she's awake. She's asking for you." He led them to the recovery room, where Mia was lying in a bed, surrounded by monitors and medical equipment. She looked small and vulnerable, but her eyes were open, and she managed a weak smile when she saw her parents. David and Sarah rushed to her side, showering her with kisses and hugs. They told her how much they loved her, how proud they were of her, and how relieved they were that she was okay. "Mommy, Daddy," Mia whispered. "What happened?" Sarah explained, as gently as possible, that she had had a large cyst on her ovary and that the doctors had removed it. She reassured her that she was going to be fine, that she was going to recover completely. Dr. Chen then stepped forward, explaining the medical situation in more detail. The cyst was quite large, he said, about the size of a grapefruit. It was pressing on her other organs, causing the severe pain. It was also producing hormones, which is what caused the false positive on the pregnancy test. He explained that the cyst was an ovarian dermoid cyst, a type of tumor that is usually benign, but can grow to a significant size and cause complications. He explained that these cysts often contain various types of tissue, such as hair, teeth, and bone. It's a strange phenomenon, he said, but it's not uncommon. And thankfully, in Mia's case, the cyst was not cancerous. We were able to remove it completely, and we don't expect any long-term complications. He explained that Mia would need to stay in the hospital for a few days for observation and pain management. She would also need regular follow-up appointments to ensure that the cyst didn't recur. David and Sarah listened intently, absorbing the information, relieved that the ordeal was over, but also still shaken by the experience. "Thank you, Doctor," David said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for saving our daughter's life." "You're welcome," Dr. Chen said. "She's a brave girl. She's going to be just fine." He smiled at Mia, then left the room, giving the family some privacy. David and Sarah sat beside Mia's bed, holding her hands, stroking her hair, and whispering words of comfort and reassurance. They were exhausted, emotionally drained, but they were also filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Their daughter was alive, she was safe, and she was going to be okay. They had been through a terrifying ordeal, but they had come through it together, their family bond strengthened by the shared experience. They knew they still had a long road ahead, but they were ready to face it together. They were grateful it was not a worse situation. The surgery itself had been a harrowing experience for David and Sarah. The waiting room had felt like a purgatory, each minute stretching into an eternity. They had paced the floor, prayed, and tried to distract themselves with magazines and conversation, but their anxiety was palpable. They had called their parents, Mia's grandparents, who lived in a neighboring state. They had explained the situation, their voices trembling with fear and uncertainty. The grandparents had immediately offered their support, promising to drive down as soon as possible. Ethan, Mia's older brother, had been surprisingly supportive. He had put aside his teenage aloofness and had sat with his parents, offering words of encouragement and trying to keep their spirits up. He had even brought Buddy, the family dog, to the hospital, hoping that his presence might provide some comfort to Mia when she woke up. The dog, of course, had to stay outside. The hours had crawled by, filled with a mixture of dread, hope, and a growing sense of helplessness. David and Sarah had tried to be strong for each other, but they were both terrified. They had imagined the worst, picturing their daughter lying on the operating table, her life hanging in the balance. They had replayed the events of the past few days in their minds, questioning their own actions, their own judgment. They had blamed themselves for not recognizing Mia's pain sooner, for not realizing that something was wrong. They had also thought about the initial misdiagnosis, the false accusation of pregnancy, and the anger and confusion they had felt. They had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume the worst. They had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of listening, of observing, and of trusting their instincts. When Dr. Chen finally emerged from the operating room, his face etched with exhaustion but his eyes filled with relief. They had felt a wave of gratitude so intense that it almost brought them to their knees. The surgery had been successful. The cyst had been removed. Mia was alive, and she was going to be okay. The hours spent waiting, the fear, the anxiety, the self-reproach, all of it had been worth it. Their daughter was safe. That was all that mattered. They knew that the recovery process would be long and challenging, both physically and emotionally, but they were prepared to face it together, as a family. They had been given a second chance, a chance to appreciate what they had, to cherish their children, and to never take their health and well-being for granted. The experience had changed them, profoundly and irrevocably. It had also brought them closer as a family. Mia's recovery was gradual but steady. She spent several days in the hospital, recovering from the surgery and receiving pain medication. She was initially weak and tired, but her spirits were high. She was relieved to be alive, relieved to be free of the pain, and relieved to be surrounded by her loving family. The nurses and doctors were amazed by her resilience, her positive attitude, and her quiet strength. She rarely complained, she followed instructions diligently, and she always had a kind word for everyone who cared for her. She was visited by her grandparents, who showered her with love and affection. She was visited by her friends, who brought her cards, flowers, and stuffed animals. She was visited by Officer Reed, who had become a familiar and comforting presence in her life. Ethan, her older brother, surprised everyone with his attentiveness and his concern for Mia. He spent hours by her bedside, playing games with her, reading to her, and simply keeping her company. He had always been protective of his little sister, but now he felt a deeper connection to her, a greater understanding of her vulnerability. David and Sarah were constantly at Mia's side, taking turns staying overnight at the hospital, holding her hand, stroking her hair, and whispering words of encouragement. They were overwhelmed with gratitude for the medical team who had saved her life, and they were determined to help her heal, both physically and emotionally. They also began to address the emotional fallout from the initial misdiagnosis. They had been so quick to believe the worst, so quick to judge their daughter, so quick to react with anger and accusation. They had learned a painful lesson about the importance of trust, communication, and understanding. They apologized to Mia repeatedly for not believing her, for not seeing her pain, for not protecting her. Mia, with the wisdom and compassion that belied her young age, forgave them. "It's okay, Mommy and Daddy," she said. "I know you were scared. I was scared too." They began to rebuild their family, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, hug by hug. They talked about their feelings, their fears, their hopes for the future. They learned to communicate more openly, to listen more attentively, and to appreciate each other more deeply. The experience had been a crucible, a trial by fire, but it had also forged a stronger bond between them, a deeper understanding of each other, and a renewed commitment to their family. They had faced a terrifying ordeal, but they had come through it together, stronger and more united than ever before. They were determined to put the event behind them. Once Mia was stable and recovering, David and Sarah requested a meeting with Dr. Chen and Dr. Carter, the resident who had initially made the pregnancy diagnosis. They wanted to understand how such a mistake could have been made, and they wanted to express their concerns about the way they had been treated. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the hospital. The atmosphere was tense, but also respectful. David and Sarah were still emotionally raw, but they were determined to be calm and rational. "Dr. Chen, Dr. Carter," David began, his voice firm but controlled. "We understand that mistakes can happen, but we need to understand how our 12-year-old daughter was misdiagnosed as pregnant. It caused us immense emotional distress, and it could have had serious consequences." Dr. Carter, looking pale and contrite, spoke first. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, I am so incredibly sorry," she said. "I made a mistake. I jumped to a conclusion based on the initial test results and the ultrasound image. I should have been more thorough. I should have considered other possibilities." Dr. Chen added, "We understand your anger and frustration, and we take full responsibility for the error. We are reviewing our procedures to ensure that this doesn't happen again." He explained that the initial pregnancy test had yielded a false positive, a rare but documented occurrence. He also explained that the ultrasound image, while suggestive of a pregnancy, could also have been interpreted as a large cyst, especially in a young girl. In retrospect, he said, "We should have ordered additional tests, such as a CT scan, before making a definitive diagnosis. We relied too heavily on the initial findings, and we failed to consider the full range of possibilities." He apologized profusely for the emotional distress they had caused the family, and he assured them that they were taking steps to improve their diagnostic protocols. Sarah, while still angry about the misdiagnosis, appreciated the doctor's honesty and their willingness to take responsibility for their mistake. "We understand that you're human," she said, "and we appreciate your apology. But we also want to make sure that this doesn't happen to another family. We want to make sure that other young girls are not subjected to the same trauma and fear that Mia experienced." Dr. Chen and Dr. Carter assured them that they would do everything in their power to prevent similar errors in the future. They promised to implement new training programs for the emergency room staff, emphasizing the importance of thoroughness, careful observation, and open communication. The meeting ended with a sense of closure, but also with a lingering sadness. The Petersons had been through a terrifying ordeal, and the scars of that experience would take time to heal. But they had also learned valuable lessons about the importance of trust, communication, and forgiveness. They had emerged from the crisis stronger, more resilient, and more determined to protect their daughter and to advocate for better medical care for all children. The hospital implemented new procedures. The months following Mia's surgery were a time of healing and adjustment for the entire Peterson family. Mia recovered physically from the surgery remarkably quickly, her youthful body bouncing back with surprising resilience. But the emotional scars were deeper and required more time and care to heal. She continued to attend therapy, working through the trauma of the initial misdiagnosis, the fear of the surgery, and the lingering anxieties about her health. She learned coping mechanisms for dealing with stress, anxiety, and the occasional flashbacks that still plagued her. She also rediscovered her love of reading, finding solace and escape in the pages of her favorite books. She started drawing again, her artwork reflecting her journey from fear and pain to hope and healing. David and Sarah, deeply affected by the experience, made significant changes in their lives. David cut back on his hours at work, prioritizing family time and making a conscious effort to be more present and engaged in his children's lives. He started taking Mia to her therapy appointments, sitting with her in the waiting room, offering his silent support. Sarah, who had always been a devoted mother, became even more protective of Mia, showering her with love and affection, but also giving her the space she needed to heal and to grow. She became more involved in Mia's school activities, volunteering in the library and attending her art shows. Ethan, too, was changed by the experience. He became more empathetic, more compassionate, and more protective of his little sister. He spent more time with her, playing games, watching movies, and simply being there for her. The Petersons also became more involved in their community. They shared their story with other families, raising awareness about the importance of early detection and treatment of ovarian cysts. They advocated for better training for medical professionals, emphasizing the need for thoroughness, careful observation, and open communication. They became a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the power of family love to overcome adversity. They had faced a terrifying ordeal, but they had emerged stronger, more united, and more determined to make a positive difference in the world. Mia, despite the challenges she had faced, blossomed into a confident, compassionate, and resilient young woman. She excelled in school, pursued her artistic passions, and developed a strong sense of self-worth. She had learned valuable lessons about the importance of trusting her instincts, of speaking up for herself, and of never giving up hope. She knew that the scars of her experience would always be a part of her, but she refused to let them define her. She had chosen to be a survivor, not a victim. She had chosen to embrace life, to pursue her dreams, and to help others along the way. She had, against all odds, found strength and purpose in the aftermath of a terrifying ordeal. The support of her family was crucial.